Today we're going to run through workflows and more specifically workflow version 2s. Obviously workflow version 2s have been around for some time now and introduced a whole stack of changes to the way that workflows are built and processed and indeed can be scripted. We do have some really comprehensive resources available in terms of documentation around workflows. I would highly recommend before anyone get going with workflows, and particularly the scripting side of things, that they do get hold of the workflows document, which is available for download from the website just via the support download section. And obviously we will provide a link to that page, to that document, when the video goes up to YouTube. Without further ado, we'll crack on. So some of the major changes that occurred between version 1 and version 2 workflows. Firstly, we added support for account applications. So version 1 workflows never had any support for account applications. And there were some new script events and things that were added as well. But probably the primary change was around the use of the workflow executor in the business layer. But previously, the workflow executor, prior to the workflow executor being available, we had our workflow functions a workflow functions library, which was available from the business layer. So FinBL.workflow functions had a whole stack of functionality in there to interact with workflows. So things like adding item groups, skipping items, completing items, all that sort of stuff was in there. The major change for version 2 is that we no longer use that function library for any of that functionality. All of that functionality was moved to our workflow executor object, and I'll run through some code examples with you shortly. The reason that we did this was to allow for things to happen inside of database transactions. So for workflow version 1s, every item was wrapped in its own database transaction, therefore executed in its own database transaction. And therefore, when it came to wanting to make calls to things like external third-party APIs, particularly for automating credit bureau lookups and all that kind of stuff, for a new application workflow, that sort of thing just wasn't possible using version 1 workflows. We had to code around that using various other means. Using the workflow executor, however, we have some functionality in there which enables us to more gracefully handle those database transactions and make those external web service calls. And again, we'll work through some samples in there as well. Just to bring everyone back to the document, though, as I say, the document that's available from the website has a whole stack of code samples and things in there as well. So there's really no reason that anyone should have to start from scratch with pretty much anything you want to do in the workflow. Document's really comprehensive, and the code's pretty well up to date in that. So looking at our workflow. A workflow type on screen, you can see here that we specified version 2. Obviously, all new workflows should be version 2s. If anyone does have any old version 1 workflows knocking around and they are to be, anyone needs changes made to them, highly recommend that they switch those over to a version 2. There are some subtle differences, but the upgrade process is not usually too painful, of course, depending on the size and complexity of the workflow. Through into our script code. Again, I'm going to export the copy of this workflow type out, and we'll make it available for download off a link from the YouTube video. The workflow itself doesn't have any items, but what it does do is to give a breakdown of all of the events in the workflow. So we're not going to go through them all one by one, but I will give you a brief overview of some of the most commonly used and what they're used for, and some of the gotchas to look out for. You see with our workflow type script, the first thing it does is declare a global variable. for our workflow executor. So that workflow executor is basically available for all of the following events. Okay, so that's not all of the events, but it's all of the ones that you should ever need to use the workflow executor for. It is an event-based script. It will be called for every single event that fires in the workflow. It's really, really important to make sure that, as with any event-based script, you don't code outside of the select case, outside of your event ID. Any code that's executed here, as a for instance, outside of that select case, will be fired for every single call made to the workflow and from the workflow. So things like can action item, which is an event in the workflow, will fire multiple times per item that's processed. So again, if you're particularly if you're loading or saving anything to the database outside of that select case, you're going to find it's going to really, really impact the performance of the workflow, and it's going to possibly impact things like your account processes and how long they take, because obviously workflows are usually processed as part of the account processes. Okay, so a quick look through some of the events that we can intercept here. We have our after initialize, and what I've done is for each of these events, I've listed some common uses along with some code samples and things, and then some other notes as well. And you'll note that in most, if not all of these events, you should never try and save or refresh the workflow. Should never be necessary from the events. They are going to, as part of the processing of the items and the workflow itself, as it flows through these events, it's going to handle that by itself. You're going to just end up tying yourself in knots if you're trying to save or refresh the workflow throughout most of these events. Again, in here, the initialize after initialize is very simple. A new workflow type has been initialized, but not at this point not saved. This is really useful for allocating, particularly for allocating users, or might even be for preventing the workflow from being created if, for instance, the account's in a state that doesn't make sense for the workflow to open. All sorts of validation checks and things you can do in here. You can add item groups. You can insert items into item groups. There's a whole stack of examples there for you as well. And again, the document breaks down each of these events and gives some pretty solid code samples and things for each as well. Moving on from after initialize, we have our after item group add. Again, very, very straightforward. This one occurs after an item group has been added. Now, bear in mind that as part of this event-based script, we are passed in the workflow. So we always have reference to the actual workflow that we're processing, as well as the workflow item that's currently being used. Workflow items are also workflow groups are also workflow items. So just bear that in mind as well when you're processing or looking for the current item. Sometimes that may be an item group, and in this instance here, after item group add, workflow item that gets passed into the script is in fact the new item group, not the first item in that group. Again, here we've listed some common uses and some notes underneath. That'll be common right the way through, and as I say, we'll provide a copy of the workflow type that we can download from the YouTube link, so you can come in and have a look. Before process, as I said before, workflows are typically processed as part of account processes. They can also be processed ad hoc using the button on the from the page from the menu rather on the workflow, the individual workflow itself. And this is particularly useful for any kind of adding any sort of validation. So a typical use case for that would be for something like an overdue workflow. You might go and check the overdue days on the account. If the overdue days is 0, then close the workflow. So those are the sorts of things that you might want to do in before process. After item group begin. So as we've already seen, we have an after item group add and an after item group begin. Primary difference here is that with the after item group add, the current item, the workflow item that's passed in, is the group itself, whereas the item here is the is the new item group. Again, some use cases and things in here, some code useful for skipping items, setting not applicable statuses based on various rules and whatever else, as well as the option to complete some items and things in there as well. Again, the workflow executor is available for that item group. As I say, if you're ever in doubt, the events that the workflow executor is available for are listed up at the top of the script. Two of the most commonly used events are before item action and after item action. Again, we won't spend too long going through them. There's some pretty comprehensive notes and samples in the document. But the primary difference between the two is that the before item action will fire before, basically before before any outcomes and things on the item have been actioned. Whereas after item action will occur once all processing has completed on that item. So before item action is useful for things like making web service calls. Again, performing external web service calls requires us to use some of the new workflow executor functionality. Things like performing a credit inquiry via script code, whatever that might be. Down here, you can see there's a couple of code samples. One which is simply setting the outcome of an item. And bear in mind that as part of the changes for workflow version 2s, can't remember if Caroline covered this off, but we did introduce the concept of having an automatic question. Those automatic questions are really useful. That wasn't a concept that we had prior to version 2s. We used to have to code around that stuff in version 1 workflows, but we can now set a question item type to be automatic, to process automatically, and you can apply whatever custom validation and things you want to occur in the before item action event, and then simply set our other parameters .set string to be the outcome that you're looking for the question. So in here you can see we have a question item that has a yes and no outcome, and this simply applies some logic, checks some logic, and applies the relevant outcome to that item. Other parameters and our outcome are passed to us at the start of the before item action event, and obviously if we want to affect the outcome, then we have to set the relevant value into our outcome there. As well as that, we've got a sample code for executing an external web service. Now, like I say, this is probably one of the primary changes for version 2, certainly one of the more powerful ones. Our web service call begin and our web service call end methods that are present on our workflow executor object. As well as that, we also have a can perform web service call. So basically the flow of code should always be a check to make sure that at the point that we need to, we are able to perform that web service call. There's no reason that we can't. There's some internal checks that happen with database transactions, things to make sure we can. Web service call begin, basically go through and I believe commit any outstanding database transactions, and then allow us to go make our external credit inquiry call or whatever that might be, and then simply call web service end call end so that we can begin a database transaction and continue processing the rest of the workflow items. So super important to remember that anytime you're going to be doing anything with an external web service, you must call begin and end, basically wrapped around your call. And again, make sure you check can perform web service call first. Again, that's that process is fleshed out in the document, and more thorough code sample is in there as well. After item action, as I said before item action, after item action, two of the primary events that you'll see used in a workflow type script. Our after item action basically means that all outcomes have been applied to our items, and all of the actions therefore have taken place, and it's used for any additional processing thereafter. Handy to know, obviously, when an item's finished, so that you can apply some code, which maybe involves skipping items and things based upon the outcome of the item that was that's just been actioned. That's probably one of the more common uses for it. And again, there are some notes at the bottom. Again, typically we're not saving or refreshing the workflow in there, please, and also just being aware of how the current item is updated. The workflow's current item is updated. Before item and after item reset, won't spend too much time on those. Basically, you can reset a workflow item via the UI, and there's a before and after event that corresponds with that action. And again, with a before close, anytime a workflow is being closed, it will fire the before close event, which gives us the option to intercept that in script and do various things. Again, common use case for that might be to actually just check that the person that's closing the workflow has permissions to do so. Before account decline, very simply, refinanced account. It's basically used instead of the before close event for refinances and things. Not too much to say about that one. Can action item, again, pretty useful. Allows us to intercept an item before it's actioned. So we might want to update some parameters or something on the item, or indeed prevent an item from being actioned. We can do that using the can action item. And again, there are some code samples in here as well. Just one thing to note with when processing anything that relates to an item, be it in can action item, before item action, or after item action, please make sure that you are checking that the item ID original of the workflow item that matches the item that you're trying to code against. If failure to do so basically means that code, if we took the if block away, then this would apply to every single item in the workflow that got processed. Okay, so every single item as it's processed will fire these events, and therefore you need to make sure that you're targeting the correct item with your code. And the easiest way to do that is to check on the item ID original. Typically in a larger script, this will be done in a select case as opposed to an init block. Could action item, this one only applies to send document type workflow items. Again, not too much to say on that one. That is, there are some common use cases and things in script code in the document, and we will probably skip past the remaining ones as well. Things like get train stops, update, and the item user data summary. These just allow us to change some of the summary pages that are generated for some things like workflow user data and workflow item user data. Okay, so alongside the workflow type scripting itself, outside of a workflow type in a normal script, we can also interact with workflows, and we can also get hold of our workflow executor so that we can make sure that we're executing everything we need to in the same way as we would if we were using it inside the workflow type. Our code snippets has a really useful snippet for initializing, creating a new account workflow or a new client workflow. You can see here in the code that that's created. We're creating a workflow object, assigning the account, and then initializing it, saving the workflow, and then it's actually the workflow process method in our workflow functions that's used to not only process the workflow. The really important thing to note here is that once you've initialized and saved your workflow, if you've got any automatic items that are set to fire at the start of the workflow, they won't fire until you process the workflow. And that be that either manually by clicking the process button on the item on the workflow itself, or via firing the workflow process function from our binbl.workflow functions. As you can see, that workflow process function accepts two arguments, one of those being the workflow itself, which is created up here. That's that workflow object, and byref, optionally byref, workflow executor. So if we are then looking to do anything further with that workflow, so be it adding item groups or adding items or whatever that might be, processing some additional items, then we will need to pass through a workflow executor that we can then use here. And you can see there's a sample here, which adds items to the start of the workflow. And then obviously, once we've done that, we need to resave that workflow. Okay, so really handy, useful workflow, create snippets for account and client workflows. We don't have one in there for account applications, probably should do, so we'll probably look to add one. But obviously the process is exactly the same. We're just changing the target object. Last thing we'll take a look at is our HTML widget scripts. Our HTML widget script itself, if we were to edit that and paste in the template code, every time we go create a new widget and we paste in our template code, we're given the option as to whether we want it just to be a standard general widget or whether we want it to apply to a workflow. So if you are coding a new widget that's going to be called via a workflow, you should always select the option here. What this will do is it will actually go through and generate you the relevant code for processing the workflow and any items thereafter. So really, really useful. You'll see that this code or variations of this code are included in a number of the standard built-in widgets. Again, they are obviously always a good base to use, but if you are starting from scratch, then just make sure you select that the correct option in your template code and also in your template text. Okay, I think that pretty much wraps everything up. We'll export copies of everything out, and we will make them available as links for download and things from the YouTube video.